In the grand villa outside Naples, powerful criminals deliberately avert their eyes as an 11-year-old boy attempts to communicate. The Camorra boss's mute son sits isolated while men mock his silence, treating him as an embarrassment. When he accidentally knocks over a ceremonial glass, cruel smiles flash across hardened faces. Suddenly, a woman with perfect posture responds to his desperate hand signals with precise movements of her own. The room freezes in shock. Recognition flashes between them as they communicate in military code that no civilian should know. The boss rises slowly, his face transforming from practiced indifference to dawning horror. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If stories of hidden strength speak to you, consider subscribing for more moments when the overlooked become the most powerful. The Villa Crisci stood like a crown upon the hills overlooking the Gulf of Naples, its 16th-century stonework and modern security measures creating a perfect blend of historical power and contemporary control. As evening approached, a procession of luxury vehicles wound their way up the Cypress Line Drive, delivering men whose influence extended from the narrow streets of Naples to government offices in Rome and beyond. Inside the grand meeting room, preparations were meticulous, ancient tapestries and Renaissance paintings providing a backdrop to modern technology discreetly integrated into the centuries-old architecture. Security personnel with earpieces and concealed weapons scanned each arrival, technology confirming identities, while practiced eyes assessed for threats. Salvatore Crisci, at 52, commanded the space with the easy confidence of 3 generations of accumulated power. His silver-streaked dark hair and bespoke Italian suit presented the image of a successful businessman, though everyone present knew the legitimate enterprises were merely the visible face of a vast criminal network. He greeted each arrival personally, government officials with warm familiarity, business partners with calculated charm, rival family representatives with precisely calibrated respect. In a window alcove overlooking the gathering, 11-year-old Marco Crisci observed it all, his slim fingers making rapid notes in a leather-bound journal. Despite being the only son and heir of the Crisci family, Marco occupied a strange position of invisibility. Born unable to speak after complications during birth, he had gradually transformed from family tragedy to family secret, present but rarely acknowledged, especially during business gatherings. As Marco watched his father expertly manage the room, his intelligent eyes missed nothing. The nervous adjustment of a city councilor's tie, the too casual way a business partner checked his watch, the subtle hand signals between security teams. When a servant approached with a tray of food, she placed it beside him without making eye contact, as if delivering to an empty table, then hurried away without waiting for acknowledgement. Marco closed his journal and made his way toward his father, who was conversing with an important judge from Naples. Salvatore's body language shifted subtly as his son approached, not turning away completely, but angling his position to minimize Marco's presence in the judge's line of sight. When Marco held up his notebook, trying to share an observation, Salvatore gently but firmly pushed it away without looking, continuing his conversation without interruption. The boy's face remained carefully neutral as he retreated, years of similar dismissals having taught him to hide any reaction. He returned to his alcove, reopening his journal to continue his observations, his expression betraying nothing of the moment's humiliation. Among the latest arrivals was an American contingent, representatives from a security firm specializing in port operations, their presence essential to the upcoming discussion of a major development project. The group passed through security with credentials that received extra scrutiny, particularly those of the lone woman among them. Vanessa Reeves presented herself with quiet professionalism, her shoulder-length brown hair styled simply, her navy blue pantsuit conservative but allowing freedom of movement. At 34, her credentials listed extensive experience in maritime security operations, though nothing in her documentation suggested military background. Yet something in her posture, the precise way she scanned the room upon entering, the measured efficiency of her movements, hinted at training beyond civilian security work. As the guests took their places for the formal meeting, Marco was directed to his usual position in a corner of the grand room, provided with a small side table for his tablet and notebook. The seating arrangement itself told a story. Salvatore at the head, key family lieutenants in positions of honor, government officials and legitimate business partners interspersed strategically, rival family representatives positioned to subtly reinforce hierarchy. Marco's corner placement put him technically within the room, but symbolically outside the circle of importance. Vanessa took her assigned seat among the American contingent, her position offering clear sightlines to all entrances and key figures. Though her attention appeared appropriately focused on the business discussion, she noted Marco's presence immediately, observing the dynamics surrounding him with subtle interest. As Salvatore formally opened the meeting, his charisma and authority filled the space. He outlined the port development project in broad strokes, its economic benefits for the region, the modernization of facilities, the expansion of capacity for international shipping. The legitimate face of the operation was impressive enough, though everyone present understood the unspoken advantages for more private enterprises. The discussion progressed to technical details, with specialists addressing security protocols and regulatory considerations. When specific maritime security questions arose, the American team leader deferred to Vanessa, whose expertise was supposedly central to their proposal. Ms. Reeves has implemented similar systems in 3 major Mediterranean ports, her colleague explained. Vanessa began a concise presentation on integrated security measures, but Enzo Falcone, Salvatore's underboss, a man with a face like weathered leather and a reputation for efficient cruelty, interrupted before she could finish her second point. "These specifications seem inadequate for our particular needs," he stated, though nothing in his tone suggested what those needs might be. "Perhaps your experience is with more, shall we say, conventional operations." The dismissal was subtle but clear. Vanessa acknowledged the comment with professional composure, neither challenging the interruption nor appearing affected by it. "I'm happy to address any specific concerns," she offered. "Later, perhaps," Salvatore intervened smoothly, redirecting the conversation toward financial arrangements that more directly concerned the government officials present. As discussion continued, Marco's tablet displayed complex shipping diagrams and security protocols, his fingers moving rapidly over the screen as he cross-referenced information. Occasionally he glanced up, his gaze moving between speakers, clearly following technical details that would challenge many adults in the room. When a debate arose regarding access restrictions between different operational zones, Marco tapped quickly on his tablet, then wrote a note on his paper. He slid from his chair and approached his father's lieutenant, Enzo, offering the folded note with a respectful gesture. Enzo glanced at the boy without fully turning his head, then deliberately shifted in his chair to continue the conversation with the Port Authority representative, effectively blocking Marco with his shoulder. The boy stood patiently for several moments, note extended, until the awkwardness of his ignored presence became uncomfortable for those nearby. Finally, Enzo turned with exaggerated patience. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his tone suggesting interruption of matters beyond a child's understanding. Marco offered the note again. Enzo took it with visible reluctance, unfolded it, scanned the contents, then refolded it and placed it in his pocket without comment or passing it to Salvatore as clearly intended. "The boy draws pictures while men conduct business," he remarked to those nearby, prompting several subtle chuckles. "Perhaps we should provide crayons next time." Marco's expression remained carefully neutral as he returned to his corner, but his hands briefly clenched beneath the table, the only visible sign of his reaction to the humiliation. Vanessa observed this interaction while appearing to review documents, her eyes briefly meeting Marco's as he returned to his seat. Something passed between them in that momentary connection, a recognition, perhaps, of parallel experiences in being underestimated or dismissed. As the meeting progressed, tensions elevated around territorial considerations between Salvatore and a rival family leader from Calabria. The discussion grew heated, voices raised slightly despite the formal setting. "The agreement was clear regarding northern access," Salvatore stated with dangerous calm. "Perhaps your memory requires refreshing, Vittorio." "My memory serves perfectly," the rival leader responded. "It's your interpretation that has conveniently evolved." During this tense exchange, Marco moved to retrieve his tablet, which contained historical documentation relevant to the dispute. As he reached across the side table, his elbow caught an antique Murano glass decanter, sending it toppling. Brandy splashed across historical documents and onto Vittorio's expensively tailored sleeve. The room fell completely silent. Everyone deliberately looked away, pretending nothing had happened, their collective denial more humiliating than any acknowledgement would have been. Salvatore's face remained impassive, though a muscle worked in his jaw. Vittorio made a show of slowly dabbing his sleeve, his smile knife-sharp as he pointedly ignored both the spill and Marco. The boy's hands moved in distressed explanation, a complex series of gestures that seemed almost militaristic in their precision and structure. No one watched except Vanessa, whose attention suddenly focused with laser intensity on Marco's hands. For the briefest moment, her professional demeanor cracked, a flash of recognition crossing her face before she carefully reassumed her neutral expression. As conversations reluctantly resumed and attention moved elsewhere, Marco retreated once more to his corner, shoulders hunched in silent misery. But when he glanced up, he found Vanessa watching him with an intensity that hadn't been there before. Something had changed. Something had been recognized. The meeting continued with increased tension, following the incident with the decanter. Territorial disputes about the port development grew more pointed, with thinly veiled threats disguised as business concerns. Throughout this escalation, Vanessa Reeves maintained her professional composure, while subtly repositioning herself to maintain clear sightlines to Marco's corner. Marco, for his part, had noticed her attention shift. Though he continued documenting the meeting in his journal, his awareness of her observation was evident in his posture and occasional glances. When the discussion turned to security protocols for restricted areas of the port, he pulled up detailed schematics on his tablet, reviewing them with focused intensity. The compartmentalization of information is essential, Enzo was explaining, directing his comments toward the legitimate business partners rather than the family representatives who already understood the subtext. Each operational team will have access only to their specific zones. The explanation continued with technical details about security measures designed to prevent unauthorized access between different sections of the port facility. As Enzo spoke, Marco's expression grew increasingly concerned, his fingers moving rapidly across his tablet screen as he accessed what appeared to be alternative security specifications. When Enzo concluded his explanation, Marco once again attempted to approach his father, this time with his tablet displaying specific technical diagrams. As he moved towards Salvatore, several men deliberately shifted their chairs, creating a physical barrier between father and son. Salvatore continued the discussion without acknowledging Marco's approach. "The timeline for implementation must be accelerated," he stated firmly. "Delays beyond the quarter will not be acceptable." After several uncomfortable moments of being effectively blocked by the circle of men, Marco attempted to pass his tablet to his father's aide instead. The man glanced at the screen, then handed it back without comment, never making eye contact with the boy. "Children and technology," one of the rival family members remarked with a dismissive chuckle, "always playing games at inappropriate moments." This comment drew several knowing smiles. The Port Authority official, perhaps feeling awkward about the situation, attempted a more kindly interpretation. "Perhaps he has interest in maritime operations. A future in the family business, yes?" "Some branches require more pruning than nurturing," Enzo responded with cold finality, looking directly at Marco for the first time. "Not all saplings grow straight and strong." The cruelty of this statement hung in the air, its meaning unmistakable to everyone present. Marco stood perfectly still, tablet clutched against his chest, his face a careful mask despite the public humiliation. Vanessa watched this exchange with growing tension in her posture. When Marco finally turned away, returning to his corner with deliberately measured steps, she shifted position again, moving to where she could see his hands more clearly. As the discussion resumed, focusing now on financial arrangements, Marco set his tablet aside and began rapidly writing in his journal. When he finished, he carefully tore out the page, folded it precisely, and slipped it into his pocket. Then, with movements that seemed casual but were clearly deliberate, his hands began forming specific shapes and positions. These weren't the typical gestures of someone emphasizing thoughts or expressing emotion. They were structured, precise movements with distinct positions and transitions. Not standard sign language, but something more codified and technical. Across the room, Vanessa's attention locked onto these movements, her eyes widening fractionally before her professional control reasserted itself. She watched several sequences, then deliberately adjusted her watch, a movement that positioned her hands to respond with her own series of precise gestures. Marco froze momentarily when he saw her response, then continued with increased intensity, his hands forming more complex patterns. Vanessa responded in kind, their silent exchange accelerating. This unusual interaction continued for several minutes, while the business discussion proceeded, neither participant obviously looking at the other, both maintaining plausible focus on the meeting. But the precision and obvious intentionality of their hand movements created an undercurrent in the room that gradually drew notice. A security officer near Vanessa observed her hands with growing suspicion. Enzo, always alert to anything unusual, began watching Marco more directly than he had all evening. Gradually, conversations faltered as awareness of this strange, silent exchange spread through the gathering. When a complete silence finally fell, Salvatore looked up from the documents he'd been reviewing, immediately sensing the shift in atmosphere. His gaze moved from the suddenly quiet attendees to his son, then to Vanessa, then back to Marco, whose hands continued their precise movements. "What is this?" Salvatore asked, his voice dangerously soft as he rose partially from his chair. Marco's hands stilled momentarily, then formed one more deliberate sequence, looking directly at Vanessa as he did so. She stood in a single fluid motion, her posture transforming subtly from professional consultant to something more alert and combat-ready. "Your son is using a classified tactical communication system," she stated clearly. "One developed specifically for naval special warfare operations." The implications of this statement rippled through the room. Security personnel shifted positions, hands moving toward concealed weapons. "And you recognize this system how exactly?" Salvatore asked, his calm tone belied by the tension evident in his posture. "Because I helped develop it," Vanessa replied simply. Marco's hands moved again, rapid and precise. Vanessa observed, then translated for the room. "He says he's been documenting everything for 3 years, every meeting, every name, every operation." Salvatore stared at his son, genuine shock breaking through his typically controlled expression. "Impossible," he stated, though uncertainty had entered his voice. "He has no access to operational information." Marco reached into his journal, removing a small thumb drive that had been concealed in the binding. His hands moved again in the tactical signs. He began learning these communications from encrypted videos on specialized forums, Vanessa translated. When he recognized operational security protocols similar to ones used in your organization, he started documenting inconsistencies and security vulnerabilities. Salvatore's expression shifted through confusion, disbelief, then dawning comprehension as he looked at his son, truly looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. "You've been watching everything," he said slowly. "All this time." Marco nodded once, his expression solemn beyond his years. "Who are you?" Enzo demanded of Vanessa, stepping toward her aggressively. "Police? Interpol?" In response, Vanessa removed a small device from her jacket pocket. "Lieutenant Commander Vanessa Reeves, United States Naval Intelligence," she stated formally. "And this compound is currently surrounded by a joint Italian-American task force." As if to confirm her words, security alerts began sounding from multiple electronic devices around the room. The head of security rushed in, speaking rapidly to Enzo and Salvatore about unusual movement patterns detected around the villa's perimeter. "What is the meaning of this?" Salvatore demanded, his composure cracking further as he looked between Vanessa and his son. "Marco is a child, my son. What have you done?" Marco's hands moved again, slower this time, with Vanessa translating. "I didn't know who to trust. I just wanted you to see me." This simple statement, delivered in the midst of an operation years in the making, struck Salvatore with visible force. He stared at his son as if truly seeing him for the first time, not as an embarrassment to be hidden or a defect to be managed, but as a person with depth and capability he had never bothered to recognize. "All this time," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "You understood everything." Marco nodded again, his expression revealing more emotion than he had shown throughout the evening. His hands formed another sequence. "He says he never intended betrayal," Vanessa translated. "He wanted recognition, not destruction." Before Salvatore could respond, the situation accelerated rapidly. Security alerts blared more urgently, and communications from the perimeter confirmed approaching forces. In the confusion, Enzo moved suddenly, grabbing Marco's arm roughly. "You little traitor!" he snarled, trying to drag the boy toward a side exit. Vanessa reacted with startling speed, crossing the space between them in seconds. Her movement was fluid and precise, separating Enzo from Marco with a controlled technique that spoke of years of specialized training. She positioned herself protectively in front of the boy without ever drawing a weapon or escalating to unnecessary violence. "The operation is focused on weapons trafficking and human smuggling networks," she stated clearly to the room. "Cooperating now will significantly impact how this proceeds." Marco's hands moved rapidly in another sequence. Vanessa hesitated before translating. "He says he's documented which parts of your operations are legitimate and which are not. The evidence is specific and compartmentalized." This revelation landed heavily in the chaotic room. Salvatore looked from Vanessa to his son, then made a decision that would reshape everything. "Stand down," he commanded his security team. "No one resists." As tactical teams began securing the compound, Salvatore stepped toward his son, moving slowly and deliberately until he stood directly before Marco. For a long moment, he simply looked at the boy, seeing perhaps for the first time the intelligence and strength that had always been there. "We will talk," he said finally. "Properly talk, with no more invisibility between us." Marco nodded, his expression a complex mixture of fear, vindication, and tentative hope. As father and son faced each other in this moment of profound revelation, the power dynamics that had defined their relationship, indeed the entire organization, shifted irrevocably. The ignored had become the pivot point around which everything would now turn. The villa's library had been converted into a temporary command center, with equipment and personnel from various agencies coordinating the complex operation, now unfolding across multiple locations. Salvatore Crisci sat at a table that had belonged to his grandfather, his expression grave but composed as he reviewed the documents spread before him. Across from him, Marco sat straight-backed in a chair too large for his frame, his tablet and journals now in the custody of intelligence officers who had treated these items with the seriousness of crucial evidence rather than a child's playthings. Vanessa Reeves, now openly operating in her capacity as naval intelligence, moved between coordination with her team and the ongoing discussion with the Criscis. Her manner remained professional but had shifted subtly, the pretense of the security consultant completely abandoned. "Your son's documentation is remarkably comprehensive," she explained, returning to the table where father and son waited, "particularly the distinction between legitimate business operations and criminal enterprises." Marco's hands moved in the tactical signs they had been using, but Salvatore raised his hand gently. "No more of that between us," he said, surprising both Marco and Vanessa. From his pocket, he withdrew a small notebook. "Your tutor provided this. Basic Italian sign language I've been learning while you were being debriefed." With obvious effort and frequent reference to the notebook, Salvatore formed several simple signs. "I want to understand you." Marco's expression transformed, a genuine smile breaking through his carefully maintained composure for perhaps the first time that evening. He responded with deliberate slowness, using the standard signs Salvatore was attempting to learn rather than the specialized tactical system. "This is unexpected," Vanessa observed, watching this exchange with professional interest, layered over something more personal. "Many things about tonight have been unexpected," Salvatore replied, his attention remaining on his son, "including the discovery that I have systematically overlooked the most observant person in my organization." Marco signed something that made Salvatore consult his notebook several times before understanding. He laughed shortly, without humor. "Yes, it is ironic that your supposed disability became your greatest strength," he agreed. "Being invisible allowed you to see everything." Vanessa cleared her throat gently. "We need to discuss next steps," she said. "The operation is continuing at multiple locations based on the intelligence Marco provided." Salvatore nodded, his expression growing serious again. "What exactly is his status in all this? He is a child, my son, not an informant or agent." "That's been the subject of considerable discussion at the highest levels," Vanessa acknowledged. "The situation is unprecedented. A minor providing intelligence of this caliber with this level of detail while also being the son of the primary subject." Marco signed rapidly, his expression concerned. "He's asking about the legitimate businesses," Vanessa translated, though Salvatore was beginning to follow some of the simpler signs, the ones he specifically documented as clean operations. Salvatore looked at his son with newfound respect. Even while documenting everything, you were protecting what could be salvaged, he observed, thinking strategically about aftermath. A senior Italian official entered, conferring briefly with Vanessa before addressing Salvatore directly. Signor Crisci, we have a proposition based on your son's extensive documentation. What followed was a complex negotiation that stretched through the night, with Marco's detailed records forming the foundation. His meticulous separation of legitimate businesses from criminal enterprises, combined with his documentation of connections to other organizations involved in weapons trafficking, created leverage that Salvatore skillfully employed. By dawn, a framework agreement had been established. Salvatore would provide testimony against international weapons traffickers and human smuggling networks. In exchange, the legitimate Crisci businesses would be separated and preserved under regulatory monitoring. Salvatore himself would face charges, but with considerations for cooperation that would significantly reduce potential sentences. Most importantly, from Salvatore's perspective, Marco would receive specialized education and protection. His status as a minor and as a source of crucial intelligence, creating a unique legal situation that the authorities were eager to resolve constructively rather than punitively. As the officials departed to formalize these arrangements, Salvatore and Marco were left alone in the library for the first time since the operation began. Morning light filtered through the ancient windows, casting the room in a gentle glow that contrasted with the tension of the night's events. "Why did you never show me you could communicate this way?" Salvatore asked, attempting some basic signs alongside his spoken words. Marco responded with a series of signs, slow enough for his father to follow parts, though Salvatore still needed Vanessa to translate fully when she returned. He tried many times, she explained after watching the exchange, but was consistently ignored or dismissed. The tactical signs were the only language that seemed important enough for people to notice. Salvatore absorbed this with visible regret. "I failed to see what was right in front of me," he acknowledged. "That was my greatest mistake." Marco signed again, his expression earnest. "He says he never wanted to destroy you," Vanessa translated, "just to make you see him, and to stop the operations that put everyone at risk." Salvatore nodded slowly. "And now, because everyone failed to see you, they will all see only me in handcuffs on the news," he observed with grim irony. "A fitting consequence for my blindness." The negotiations continued over the following weeks as Marco's documentation proved invaluable to authorities targeting larger criminal networks. The villa remained under surveillance but operational as a base, with most staff dismissed except those connected to legitimate businesses that Marco had identified as clean. Enzo Falcone and several other key lieutenants had been detained separately, their involvement in the most serious criminal enterprises documented extensively in Marco's records. The thoroughness of these records continued to astonish investigators, revealing a level of detail that adult informants rarely achieved. "Your son has an extraordinary memory and observational skills," commented the lead Italian investigator during one debriefing session. The connections he documented between seemingly unrelated conversations from different meetings months apart, the financial details he managed to record without access to official records, the security protocols he identified just from observation, all of it is remarkable. Salvatore listened to these assessments with complex emotions visible on his face. Pride in his son's capabilities mingled with regret for having failed to recognize them himself. Throughout these sessions, he remained close to Marco, his protective instincts now openly displayed rather than buried beneath the previous facade of indifference. For his part, Marco seemed to be adapting to his new visibility with cautious optimism. The silence that had once been perceived as a deficiency was now recognized as one element of an extraordinary perceptual intelligence. He continued using sign language, both standard Italian signs with his father and the specialized tactical system when working with Vanessa and her team on operational details. During a particularly intensive debriefing about security vulnerabilities in the port development project, Vanessa noticed Marco's growing fatigue. Though he maintained focus and continued signing precise answers to complex questions, the strain of sustained communication was evident. "I think we should continue this tomorrow," she suggested, interrupting a technical question from one of her colleagues. Marco has been providing detailed information for 6 hours straight. The intelligence officer looked ready to object, but Salvatore stood, effectively ending the session. "My son needs rest," he stated, "not a request, but a declaration. The information will still be there tomorrow." This protective gesture, small but significant, represented a profound shift in the father-son dynamic. Where once Salvatore had exposed Marco to endless meetings without concern for his comfort or inclusion, now he actively monitored his son's well-being and asserted boundaries when necessary. Later that evening, as Marco prepared for sleep in his room, now equipped with improved communication technology and educational resources, Salvatore sat beside him, practicing the sign language he continued learning with determined consistency. "The investigators say your information will help dismantle 3 major trafficking networks," he told his son, his signs still awkward but increasingly functional. "Lives will be saved because of what you did." Marco responded with a series of signs, his expression serious. "I know," Salvatore replied to the question he could now understand without translation. "I will honor my agreements. The testimony I provide will match your documentation. There will be consequences for me, but they are deserved." Marco shook his head, signing something more complex that Salvatore couldn't follow completely. "He says the consequences were never the point," Vanessa translated from the doorway, where she had arrived for a scheduled security update. "That changing what happens next matters more than punishment for what happened before." Salvatore considered this perspective, so different from the retribution-focused mentality that had dominated his world. "You have your mother's wisdom," he said finally. She too could see beyond the immediate reaction to the longer path. This rare mention of Marco's mother, who had died when he was barely 4 years old, created a moment of connection between father and son that transcended the operational complexities surrounding them. As weeks passed, the villa settled into a new rhythm. Security remained tight but less obtrusive, integrated into daily operations rather than an overwhelming presence. Salvatore divided his time between legal proceedings, where his testimony was proving critical to larger prosecutions, and focused attention on his son's development. Marco began working with specialized tutors, his educational program customized to his extraordinary capabilities, while addressing the social isolation his previous invisibility had created. His communication options expanded with technology that translated his signs into multiple languages, allowing him to interact more broadly with the various officials and specialists now regularly present at the villa. Through it all, Vanessa remained a consistent presence, her role evolving from operational management to something more comprehensive. Her background in naval intelligence provided the tactical framework for ongoing security, while her growing relationship with Marco created a bridge between his unique perspective and the institutional requirements of the various agencies involved. One morning, approximately 2 months after the operation began, Salvatore found Vanessa and Marco on the villa's terrace, engaged in what appeared to be an evaluation rather than a debriefing. Marco sat before a series of complex puzzles and pattern recognition challenges, completing them with remarkable speed, while Vanessa timed and noted his responses. "What exactly are you testing?" Salvatore asked, observing from the doorway. "Not testing, confirming," Vanessa replied, showing him the results. Marco's cognitive processing, particularly in pattern recognition and systems analysis, ranks in the highest percentiles ever recorded in these assessments. Salvatore watched as his son completed another sequence, his slim fingers moving with confident precision across the tablet screen. "And this matters to your agency because intelligence work is evolving," Vanessa explained. "Traditional field operations like mine are being supplemented by analytical capabilities that identify patterns and connections human agents might miss. Marco's abilities, combined with his documented observational skills, represent a significant resource." "He's 11 years old," Salvatore stated flatly. "Not a resource." Marco looked up at this, signing quickly to his father. "I know you can make your own decisions," Salvatore responded, having progressed significantly in understanding Marco's signs. "But they should be a child's decisions, not an intelligence asset's." Vanessa closed her assessment files, her expression thoughtful. "That's precisely the balance we're trying to establish," she acknowledged. "Recognizing Marco's extraordinary capabilities without exploiting them, supporting his development without restricting it." Marco signed again, this time a longer sequence that Salvatore followed with growing comprehension. He says being treated as invisible was worse than any pressure from being seen. Vanessa translated the portion Salvatore missed, that using his abilities gives them purpose rather than making them a burden. This perspective seemed to resonate with Salvatore, who had been struggling to reconcile his protective instincts with respect for his son's demonstrated capabilities. Then we find the middle path, he decided. Neither invisibility nor exploitation. Recognition with appropriate boundaries. The practical implementation of this philosophy emerged over the following weeks. Marco continued providing analytical support to the ongoing investigations, but with structured limits on his involvement and regular assessments of his well-being. His education expanded beyond traditional subjects to include formal training in the communication systems he had initially taught himself, now guided by qualified instructors. Salvatore's legal situation progressed toward a negotiated resolution with significant penalties for acknowledged crimes balanced against the extraordinary cooperation he had provided. The legitimate businesses Marco had identified were restructured under independent management, preserving employment for hundreds of workers while implementing strict compliance protocols. Through it all, the father-son relationship continued its transformation. Salvatore's initial shock at discovering his son's capabilities evolved into genuine appreciation and respect. The sign language that had once been foreign to him became a natural part of their daily interaction, sometimes supplemented by Marco's communication devices, but increasingly functioning independently as Salvatore's proficiency improved. One evening, as they reviewed Marco's progress reports from his tutors, Salvatore noticed something unusual in his son's demeanor, a hesitation that hadn't been present during even the most intense debriefings with authorities. "What's troubling you?" he asked directly, signing alongside his spoken question, as had become his habit. Marco set aside the tablet he'd been using and signed a question that took Salvatore by surprise. "Will you be ashamed of me when this is over?" Salvatore stared at his son, momentarily unable to respond. "Ashamed? Of you? Why would you think that?" Marco's hands moved in a complex explanation that Salvatore followed with growing comprehension and dismay. The boy expressed concern that once the operational value of his actions diminished, once the intelligence agencies and prosecutors had what they needed, his father might revert to seeing his muteness as an embarrassment rather than simply one aspect of who he was. "Marco," Salvatore said finally, carefully forming the signs to accompany his words, "my shame was never about your silence. It was about my failure, my weakness in caring too much about appearance and too little about substance. I couldn't see past what others might think to what you actually are." He moved his chair closer to his son's, ensuring the boy could see both his expressions and his signs clearly. "You have shown more courage and integrity in 11 years than I have demonstrated in my entire life. There is no circumstance in which I could ever be ashamed of you again. The shame is mine alone, for having failed to see you sooner." Marco studied his father's face intently, searching for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, he nodded once, then signed a simple response. "I believe you." These 3 words, expressed through the movement of his hands rather than his voice, carried the weight of a profound shift in trust between them. The silent observer, who had documented everything, had finally seen something he could believe in without reservation, a transformation as genuine as it was unexpected. The following day brought news that several major arrests had been made based on Marco's intelligence and Salvatore's testimony, dismantling a weapons trafficking network that extended across 3 countries. The lead prosecutor arrived at the villa to personally deliver an update, accompanied by Vanessa and several senior officials. "The operation has been an unqualified success," the prosecutor announced, spreading photographs and documents across the library table. 17 key operatives in custody, shipments intercepted in 2 ports, and financial assets frozen across multiple jurisdictions. As the officials discussed the operational details, Marco watched from his place beside his father, no longer relegated to a corner, but positioned at the center of the conversation. When technical questions arose about how certain connections had been identified, the officials turned to him directly, Vanessa translating his signed responses with professional precision. The pattern emerged from shipping manifests that used consistent code words across different companies. She translated as Marco's hands moved in detailed explanation. He noticed the repetition during separate meetings months apart and began tracking the terminology. The prosecutor shook his head in amazement. "We had analysts working on these connections for years without identifying the pattern," he acknowledged. Yet a child sitting quietly in the corner put it together from overheard conversations. "Not just a child," Salvatore corrected, his pride evident. "My son, Marco Crisci." This simple declaration of relationship and identity, delivered without qualification or apology, represented the completion of a circle that had begun the night everything changed. The boy once deliberately made invisible was now not only seen, but celebrated for exactly who and what he was. As the meeting concluded, the prosecutor addressed Marco directly. "Young man, your contributions to this case have been extraordinary," he stated formally. "Lives will be saved because of what you've helped us accomplish." Marco nodded acknowledgement, then signed a question that Vanessa translated. "What happens next?" It was a question that carried multiple layers of meaning, addressing not just the operational outcomes, but the personal futures now being reshaped by these events. "Next," the prosecutor replied after consideration, "we build something better from what remains, just as you have been doing all along." Later that evening, as the villa settled into the quieter routine that had replaced the constant operational activity of previous weeks, Salvatore found Marco in the garden, watching the sunset over the Gulf of Naples. The view remained as spectacular as it had been on the night everything changed, but the context had transformed entirely. "The prosecutor asked if you would consider consulting on other cases," Salvatore mentioned, taking a seat beside his son on the stone bench. "Cases involving similar trafficking networks where your pattern recognition might help." Marco signed a question about logistics and boundaries. "Only with appropriate limitations," Salvatore confirmed. "Educational priorities would remain primary, involvement strictly analytical rather than operational, and my presence required throughout." Marco considered this, then signed his tentative agreement, adding a condition that made Salvatore smile. "Yes, Vanessa would continue as liaison," he confirmed. "I believe that arrangement works well for everyone involved." As darkness gradually claimed the landscape before them, father and son sat in companionable silence, their relationship fundamentally transformed from what it had been just months before. The boy, once treated as an embarrassment to be hidden, had become not only acknowledged but valued, his unique perspective recognized as an asset rather than a liability. In that peaceful moment, with the distant lights of Naples beginning to twinkle along the coastline, Salvatore reflected on how completely his world had been upended by finally seeing what had always been right before him. The silent observer had ultimately observed him into a better version of himself, a transformation he would never have chosen, but now wouldn't trade for all his previous power. "You know," he said finally, signing alongside his words as had become natural, "in our old world, I thought strength meant making others fear you. Now, I wonder if perhaps true strength lies in having the courage to see clearly, even when the truth is uncomfortable." Marco nodded, then signed a response that summed up his extraordinary journey from invisibility to recognition. "The most powerful person in any room is the one nobody thinks to watch." 6 months after the operation that transformed the Crisci family's world, Villa Crisci hosted a gathering unlike any in its long history. The grand meeting room where Marco had once been deliberately ignored now featured a different configuration, with technical equipment and presentation screens replacing the imposing formal table that had previously dominated the space. Security remained present but discreet, a necessary precaution given the villa's new function as a specialized analysis center rather than a criminal headquarters. The guests arriving today represented a different kind of power, intelligence officials and law enforcement leadership, rather than rival crime families and corrupt politicians. Salvatore Crisci greeted each arrival with the same polished courtesy he had always displayed, though his demeanor had subtly shifted from intimidating authority to respectful collaboration. His legal situation had stabilized into a complex arrangement of limited immunity in exchange for ongoing cooperation, allowing him to remain at the villa under surveillance while contributing to multiple international prosecutions. At his side stood Marco, no longer relegated to shadows, but positioned as an equal participant in the day's proceedings. At 11, he remained small for his age, but his posture conveyed a quiet confidence that had grown steadily over the months of recognition and appropriate responsibility. The tablet he carried now was the latest specialized communication technology, capable of translating his signs into multiple languages simultaneously for the international visitors. Among the arriving officials was Vanessa Reeves, though her presence represented continuity rather than a special visit. Her role had formalized into a permanent liaison position, coordinating between the various agencies benefiting from Marco's analytical capabilities while ensuring the boundaries established for his protection remained firmly in place. "Everything is prepared," she confirmed to both Critius as the last guests settled into their positions. "The demonstration is set to begin whenever you're ready." Salvatore nodded, then turned to his son. "Are you comfortable with this?" he asked, his signs now fluid and confident after months of dedicated practice. Marco responded with a brief sequence of signs, his expression calm and focused. "Then we proceed," Salvatore agreed, moving toward the center of the room where their visitors waited. The gathering represented the culmination of months of specialized work, as Marco's unique analytical capabilities had been methodically applied to trafficking networks beyond those directly connected to the Crisci organization. Today's presentation would demonstrate the results of this collaboration, the patterns and connections identified through his extraordinary observational skills and memory. "Ladies and gentlemen," Salvatore began formally, addressing the assembled officials, "thank you for joining us today. What you are about to see represents a new approach to dismantling criminal networks, one that combines traditional intelligence with specialized pattern recognition that conventional analysis has sometimes missed." He gestured toward Marco, who stepped forward with his tablet. "My son will now demonstrate the methodology that has proven effective in identifying previously hidden connections across seemingly separate operations." With that simple introduction, Marco began the presentation they had carefully prepared. As his hands moved in sign language, his tablet translated in real time, projecting his words onto the main screen, while simultaneously displaying the complex data visualizations he had developed. "Trafficking networks rely on compartmentalization to protect operations," his translated text explained. "But human communication naturally creates patterns that transcend deliberate barriers. These patterns become visible when data is viewed across conventional boundaries." What followed was a sophisticated demonstration of how Marco had identified linguistic patterns across multiple criminal organizations, consistent terminologies that revealed connections between operations that had appeared unrelated during conventional investigation. His methodology combined technical analysis with the human observational skills he had developed during years of being the ignored presence in crucial meetings. The officials watched with growing interest as Marco methodically displayed how he had mapped these patterns across geographic and organizational boundaries, revealing a previously undetected supply chain that connected weapons manufacturing in Eastern Europe with distribution networks in North Africa, all coordinated through seemingly legitimate shipping operations in Mediterranean ports. The critical connections emerged not from digital evidence but from human conversations. The translation of his signs continued. Consistent terminology and reference patterns that appeared in multiple contexts, suggesting standardized training or central coordination. As the presentation progressed, several intelligence officials began asking technical questions, addressing Marco directly rather than through Salvatore or Vanessa. This simple courtesy, treating him as a respected analyst rather than a child or a curiosity, reflected how completely perceptions had shifted over the months of collaboration. When the formal presentation concluded, the lead Italian prosecutor stood to address the group. "What we've witnessed today represents a significant advancement in our approach to these networks," he stated. "The methodology demonstrated by Marco Crisci has already directly contributed to 37 arrests across 5 countries, the interception of weapons shipments valued at over 40 million euros, and the identification of previously unknown coordination centers." The prosecutor turned toward Marco with genuine respect. "This work has unquestionably saved lives and disrupted operations we had been tracking unsuccessfully for years." As the officials broke into smaller discussion groups to explore specific aspects of the methodology, Salvatore observed his son with undisguised pride. The boy who had once been deliberately made invisible was now the focus of respectful attention from some of the most powerful law enforcement officials in Europe and beyond. "You've created something remarkable," Vanessa commented quietly, joining Salvatore as he watched Marco engaged in detailed technical discussion with several intelligence analysts, his tablet translating his rapid signs seamlessly. "He created it," Salvatore corrected. "I merely stopped preventing it from being seen." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a distinguished-looking official who had been observing the proceedings with particular interest. The man introduced himself as Director Navarro, head of a specialized Europol division focused on transnational organized crime. "Signor Crisci," he addressed Salvatore formally, "I wish to discuss the possibility of establishing a more permanent framework for your son's analytical contributions. The methodology he has developed has applications beyond the current cases." Salvatore maintained his diplomatic expression, though his posture subtly shifted to a more protective stance. Any such framework would need to prioritize Marco's well-being and development above operational considerations, he stated firmly. "He is first my son, then an analyst." "Of course," Navarro agreed readily. "What we envision would be structured around his educational needs, with appropriate limitations on time commitment and scope of involvement. Commander Reeves has been quite clear about the necessary parameters." As the discussion continued, Marco concluded his conversation with the analysts and approached the group. Director Navarro smoothly adjusted his focus, addressing Marco directly rather than speaking about him to his father. "Your work is exceptional," he stated, waiting for Marco's tablet to process his signs before continuing. "I believe it could form the foundation for a specialized analytical division if you're interested in continuing this collaboration." Marco considered this proposal thoughtfully, then signed a response that his tablet translated. "I would be interested in contributing under appropriate conditions. The patterns become clearer with more data across different organizations." The conversation evolved into a detailed discussion of how such an arrangement might work, with Salvatore, Marco, and Vanessa all contributing specific requirements and boundaries. What emerged was the framework for a specialized analytical role that would respect Marco's status as a minor while providing structured support for his extraordinary capabilities. As the meeting concluded and the officials began departing, Director Navarro had one final comment. "There will be a formal recognition ceremony next month at Europol headquarters," he informed them. "Several of the cases Marco's analysis helped resolve have reached conclusion, and there is consensus that his contributions should be officially acknowledged." After the last guests had departed, Salvatore, Marco, and Vanessa gathered in the villa's private study to discuss this unexpected development. The room had been transformed over recent months into a space that reflected Marco's interests and needs, with advanced communication technology, specialized educational resources, and comfortable furnishings that acknowledged his central role in the household, rather than relegating him to its margins. "A formal ceremony presents both opportunities and concerns," Vanessa observed, always mindful of security implications. "Public recognition of Marco's role creates potential vulnerabilities." Salvatore nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yet, refusing such recognition would contradict everything we've been working toward, the acknowledgement of his capabilities and contributions." Marco signed his perspective, which his tablet translated. "I would like to attend. Recognition matters not for pride, but for establishing the value of different kinds of communication and observation." This simple statement encapsulated the journey they had all undertaken, from a world where Marco's silence had been perceived as a deficiency to one, where his unique form of communication was recognized as valuable precisely because of its differences. "Then we will make it happen," Salvatore decided, "with appropriate security measures." The following weeks brought intensive preparation for both the ceremony and the formalization of Marco's analytical role with the European agencies. Educational assessments confirmed what had become increasingly obvious, that his intellectual capabilities extended far beyond typical expectations for his age, requiring a customized approach to his development that balanced academic advancement with appropriate social and emotional support. Throughout this period, Salvatore remained consistently engaged with every aspect of his son's life, a dramatic contrast to his previous detachment. The sign language that had initially been a challenge had become a natural part of their communication, sometimes supplemented by Marco's translation technology, but increasingly functioning independently as they developed their own familial shortcuts and references. One evening, as they reviewed the security arrangements for the upcoming ceremony, Salvatore noticed Marco studying him with unusual intensity. "What are you thinking?" he asked, signing alongside his words as had become habitual. Marco set his tablet aside, preferring to communicate directly through signs for this more personal conversation. His hands formed a question that took Salvatore by surprise. "Are you ever angry about how everything changed?" Salvatore considered this carefully, understanding the layers beneath the question. Angry that my criminal operations were exposed? That my freedom is now restricted? That my former associates are imprisoned? Marco nodded, his expression serious beyond his years. "I was at first," Salvatore admitted honestly. "Change is rarely comfortable, especially when forced rather than chosen. But anger requires energy that is better directed elsewhere now." He paused, forming his next thoughts carefully, both in mind and in signs. "What I've gained is worth more than what was lost. Seeing you, truly seeing you, has given me something I didn't know was missing." Marco's expression softened slightly, but his hands formed another challenging question. "Would you have ever seen me if I hadn't forced it?" This question struck at the heart of their transformed relationship, addressing the uncomfortable reality that recognition had come through crisis rather than natural evolution. Salvatore could have offered reassurance, a comfortable fiction that recognition would have eventually occurred without intervention, but the trust they had built demanded honesty. "I don't know," he answered finally. "I was blind in ways I didn't recognize. Sometimes people cannot see what is directly before them, without something forcing their perspective to shift." He reached across the table, gently touching Marco's hand. "But that doesn't diminish the value of what we have now. Sometimes the path matters less than the destination." Marco nodded, accepting this answer with the maturity that continued to surprise even those who had come to know him well. His hands formed one more observation. "Invisibility taught me to see clearly. Perhaps visibility is teaching you the same lesson." The wisdom in this simple statement lingered with Salvatore long after their conversation ended, a reminder of how profoundly their roles had shifted. The father who had once been the unquestioned authority was now frequently the student, learning from the son he had previously dismissed. The day of the ceremony arrived with clear skies and tight security. The Europol headquarters in The Hague had been prepared with both physical and operational measures to ensure the safety of all participants, particularly Marco, whose involvement in dismantling multiple criminal networks created inherent risks despite his protected legal status. Salvatore and Marco arrived under escort, Vanessa coordinating security details with practiced efficiency. The ceremony had been carefully designed to provide appropriate recognition while respecting Marco's age and unique communication needs. His translation technology had been integrated with the venue's systems, ensuring his signed contributions would be seamlessly shared with all attendees. As they entered the formal hall, Salvatore noted the distinguished gathering with a businessman's practiced assessment of power and influence. High-ranking officials from multiple countries, intelligence directors, prosecutors, and law enforcement leadership created an assembly that would have been unimaginable in his previous life, at least in any context other than adversarial. Director Navarro greeted them personally, escorting them to their designated positions with formal courtesy. "Everything has been arranged according to the agreed parameters," he assured them. "The ceremony will acknowledge Marco's contributions while maintaining appropriate protective considerations." The formal proceedings began with presentations on the successfully concluded operations, carefully edited to protect ongoing investigations while highlighting the significant results achieved. Multiple speakers referenced the innovative analytical methodology that had helped break previously impenetrable organizational barriers. Though in accordance with security protocols, the specific nature of Marco's involvement remained somewhat veiled in the public portions of the ceremony. When the time came for the formal recognition, Director Navarro approached the podium with an ornate leather portfolio. "It is now my honor to present a special commendation," he announced. "While full details must remain classified for security reasons, we recognize extraordinary service that has directly resulted in the disruption of dangerous criminal networks and the protection of countless potential victims." He turned toward where Marco sat beside his father, adjusting his approach to address the boy directly rather than speaking about him in the third person. Your unique perspective and methodology have changed how we understand these organizations. The patterns you identified were invisible to conventional analysis but proved crucial to operational success. From the portfolio, he removed an ornately designed certificate with multiple official seals. This commendation represents the gratitude of 7 nations whose citizens are safer because of your contributions. As he presented the document to Marco, Director Navarro did something unexpected. He stepped back and rendered a formal military-style salute, a gesture of profound respect rarely offered to civilians and never to children. More surprising still, the assembled officials throughout the hall rose in unison, each offering the same salute appropriate to their respective services and nations. The spontaneous nature of this gesture was evident in its slight variations, yet the collective intent was unmistakable. A room full of powerful individuals, acknowledging the extraordinary contributions of a child they would once have overlooked entirely. Marco's expression revealed rare emotional transparency as he absorbed this unprecedented recognition. He looked to his father briefly, then stood and returned the salute with solemn dignity, before signing a brief response that the translation system projected for all to see. "Thank you for seeing what I observed. May we continue to make visible what others wish to hide." The simple eloquence of this statement resonated throughout the hall, capturing the essence of both his personal journey and the operational successes being celebrated. As the formal ceremony transitioned to a more relaxed reception, officials approached Marco individually, many attempting basic signs they had clearly practiced for the occasion. This simple courtesy, the effort to communicate on his terms rather than expecting him to adapt to theirs, represented perhaps the most meaningful recognition of all. Salvatore observed these interactions with complex emotions, pride in his son's accomplishments mingling with lingering regret for the years of dismissal that had preceded this recognition. Vanessa joined him, maintaining professional vigilance despite the secure environment. "He handles this with remarkable grace," she observed. "Many adults would become overwhelmed by such attention." "He had years to observe power dynamics while being considered irrelevant to them," Salvatore replied. "Perhaps the best preparation for handling recognition is extended experience with its absence." As the reception continued, a distinguished Italian judge approached them, one who had been involved in negotiating the complex legal arrangements surrounding Salvatore's cooperation. "Your son's contributions have been extraordinary," the judge acknowledged. "But I must also recognize your own role in this transformation, Signor Crisci. The cooperation you have provided goes beyond mere legal necessity. There appears to be genuine commitment to this new path." Salvatore considered this assessment thoughtfully. "When you discover you have been blind to what matters most, continued blindness becomes impossible to justify," he replied. "Marco showed me a different kind of strength than the one I had valued previously. I am still learning its applications." Later, as they prepared to depart the ceremony, Marco signed something to his father that made Salvatore pause thoughtfully. "What did he say?" Vanessa asked, noticing the impact of the communication. "He said that today completes a circle," Salvatore translated. "From being invisible in a room where everyone pretended not to see him, to being the focus of a room where everyone makes the effort to truly see." This observation, simple yet profound, captured the extraordinary journey they had all undertaken. From a world where power was measured in fear and intimidation, where differences were perceived as weaknesses to be hidden, they had transitioned to one where unique perspectives were recognized as valuable precisely because of their differences. As they departed the Europol headquarters, returning to the villa that had transformed from criminal stronghold to specialized analytical center, Salvatore reflected on the unexpected path that had led them here. The son he had once considered a disappointment, a liability to be minimized, had become not only his greatest pride, but the catalyst for his own transformation. The security teams coordinated their movements with practiced efficiency, Vanessa overseeing the transition from the ceremony venue to their transport with professional focus. Yet beneath the operational procedures, there was now a fundamental recognition of Marco as not merely a subject to be protected, but an individual whose contributions had earned profound respect. That evening, back at Villa Crisci, Marco placed the formal commendation in his room, not displayed prominently, but integrated among his books and educational materials, one element of his identity rather than its defining feature. Salvatore found him later on the terrace, watching the lights of ships moving across the Gulf of Naples, the same view they had shared for years, but now experienced through an entirely different relationship. "Was the ceremony what you hoped for?" Salvatore asked, joining his son at the stone balustrade. Marco considered this question before signing his response. It represented appropriate recognition without becoming spectacle. The salute was unexpected but meaningful. Salvatore nodded, understanding the layers in this assessment. "Recognition matters when it acknowledges capability rather than difference," he observed. "They saw your strength today, not what others once perceived as weakness." Marco signed agreement, then added an observation that struck Salvatore with its perception. "The most powerful moment wasn't the salute or the certificate. It was when people tried to sign to me, making themselves temporarily vulnerable to potential mistakes in order to communicate on my terms rather than theirs. This insight captured something essential about their journey, the recognition that true strength often manifested in unexpected forms, sometimes in vulnerability rather than invulnerability, in adaptation rather than dominance." As they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the distant lights of ships navigating the darkness, Salvatore reflected on how completely his understanding of power had transformed. The empire he had built through intimidation and violence had crumbled, yet somehow in that collapse, something more valuable had emerged, a relationship built on genuine recognition rather than fear, on seeing clearly rather than strategic blindness. The boy who had been rendered invisible had ultimately become the one who helped others see, including the father who had once been most determined not to notice. In that transformation lay not weakness, but extraordinary strength, not loss, but unexpected gain. The silent observer had found his voice, not through speech, but through being truly seen. And in that recognition, both father and son had discovered a power more genuine than anything force or fear could ever have provided. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition, but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who worked silently in the background, changing everything while others took the credit.